So, good afternoon, or good morning, or good night, depending on where you've tuned in from. Before I dive in, I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. I'm a serial entrepreneur, which I'm starting to learn is just another way of saying an investor who can't stand to be passive. I'm currently the co-founder of a company called Centurica. We're a relatively new company formed by three people who have all had substantial experience in online acquisitions. Some of you may already know my two partners, who are super smart guys that I'm fortunate to be working with. We assist buyers with due diligence and consult on every part of the process, from the LOI right at the start through to the completion and transfer parts of the deal. So most deals we tend to work on with Centurica are generally between 50,000 and 5 million in value. Prior to that, I also built a site called flipfilter.com, which is primarily aimed at the sub 50k marketplace and auction deal buyers. It helps you sort through all the listings currently out there and gets you to what you need to know with the minimum wasted time possible. And some guys love DIY, some love fishing. I happen to love internet business to a point where I'd even call it my hobby. And I've bought, built, and sold several internet businesses over the last 10 years. And most of those are e-commerce or SaaS apps. And I also love to share what I've learned through doing and often through failing too. So everything you're about to see in this webinar is the result of developing that system, which almost ensures that when we buy an internet business, it's one that's always profitable for us in the mid and the long term. So we have that 99.9% guarantee because we do solid due diligence up front. And whilst we can't predict everything that might happen, we do a good job of avoiding the majority of things that would otherwise cause the venture to fail. So I guess the real question is, what's possible with good DD? So you're probably on this webinar because the idea of buying an internet business appeals to you on some level, probably for the same reason that it initially appealed to me. And regardless of whether this is something you intend to do full-time, part-time, or somewhere in between, you find yourself with a unique opportunity to instantly own 100% of a cash flow positive business at a fraction of the cost of even part-owning property. You find you're going to have more control over what happens to your investment than with, say, stocks and shares. You're running a business with a low ongoing capital requirement, and you're able to run that business from almost anywhere in the world where you've got internet access. And you can realistically achieve an internal rate of return above 30%, most likely making this the most profitable use of your money. But that being said, it's not all fun and money showers. You already know that this is an investment. So for one, that means the value can go down as well as going up. And I've been part of hundreds of transactions in one way or another over the last few years. And that's been crucial in getting an understanding of where things typically go wrong. And the most common problems you tend to face are falling prey to tricks, scams, and misrepresentation when you buy a website. So, for example, the seller claims that there's $5,000 net every month. Then when you get into it, you actually find that there's really $2,000 net, and then you find that he's forgot to include $1,000 of costs, and he's probably forgot to mention as well that he's spending $4,000 in advertising to generate that. Another example is where you lose traffic and ultimately revenue several months after you've made a purchase. So, for example, you buy a site, and despite the seller's best intentions, that site maybe gets hit with an algorithm update or a penalty. And if you're reliant on that traffic, you see that traffic rapidly drop, and hence you lose visitors and lose revenue with it. You can also see a drop in revenue from a product that's maybe seasonal, or a product that's sort of poorly executed, or possibly increased competition and clones. If any of you are familiar with buying from marketplaces, you'll know it's not uncommon to buy a site and then possibly see the same seller selling a replica of that site to exactly the same market 3 or 4 months later. Another one which people often fail to realize is buying a website that has tons of potential, but ultimately being unable to realize that potential once you own the site. And this really has nothing to do with the seller, but it's more, for example, if you buy a website and that website is generating money through AdSense, and you see a huge opportunity to generate money through changing the monetization and maybe going with direct ad sales or developing a product and selling the product to that same target market, but then you realize that actually that target market aren't looking to pay for a solution. The only thing they will do is click on adverts. Then you've missed out on the opportunity which you may have otherwise paid a premium for. So if you bought 10 internet businesses that all had quote-unquote issues, these issues I've just mentioned are the ones you'd probably encounter, I'd say 80% plus of the time. So fortunately, there's not a single problem in that list that can't be avoided with the right strategy and knowledge of what to look for before you buy, which is essentially good due diligence. Buying a website and turning it into a profitable business will never be 100% risk-free, but I'll aim to show you how it's possible to reduce that risk down to an absolute minimum when buying for yourself. So with the right information and some experience on your side, this is a fairly routine and predictable business that will more than likely give you sensible returns from day one. In this webinar, we'll give you a 20 to 30 minute primer on exactly what you need to know to make good, profitable purchases. And I'll break everything down and show you a framework that you can replicate to save yourself hours in time spent searching and thousands in what you'll save from not making the wrong purchase. So let's dive in and take a look at the two most crucial things you'll need to understand in order for all this to make sense. So ultimately, the idea in having a good due diligence system is split between saving you time and saving you money. So you save time when you're looking for something suitable to purchase. If you ever found yourself looking at lots of brochures or listings only to realize that you've wasted hours and still not found anything worth buying, then you'll appreciate exactly why this is important. And a shocking amount of bad purchases are made not because the buyer didn't know better, but simply because they end up getting purchase fatigue and they lose hope after seeing tens of deals that just weren't right. So eventually that pressure to get started takes over and they purchase the first half decent listing that comes their way, regardless of whether or not it's the right purchase to make. It's that whole expression or theory of the money burning a hole in your pocket, and I'm sure we've probably all been there at some point where you've got the cash and you know what you need or want to do and you just want to get in the game. It's hard sometimes to resist that temptation not to go ahead and just get something to get started. Having a clear set of rules before you start will mean quickly dismissing listings without spending more than a couple of minutes on each one, leaving you with enough energy to focus on what's right for you. And this is your time saving and what we look at with subjective due diligence. And then on the flip side, there's the money saving, and that can happen in two stages. Once before you've bought the business, as you're able to assess the price based on its benefits, which you're told, and its shortcomings, which you hopefully discover, and you make an offer that reflects that. And alternatively, you make the biggest saving when you discover a business that you would have otherwise bought is set to lose half its monthly revenue, or worse still, completely cease to exist several months after you've bought it. And this is what we cover with fact-based due diligence. And there's naturally some overlap between subjective and fact-based DD, but here's a quick outline of where they differ. So subjective is really about your personal objectives and criteria for owning different types of digital business. It's subjective because it can vary person to person. For example, I may be happy owning a business in the consumer electronics niche, for example, because I own a company with distribution rights to a particular appliance or gadget. But I know many people who would instantly see that vertical as a red flag because of the constant changes and limited options for monetization in that industry. Fact-based is all about the business you're thinking of purchasing, and it will never vary buyer to buyer. It looks at hard facts such as the amount of traffic a site receives from search or other domains and sites owned by that seller that may be positioned to compete with the site post-sale. These two systems work together to ensure that you make the right purchase. So your subjective DD lays the foundation for what's acceptable and what isn't based on your fact-based due diligence report findings. For example, you might decide that a site that relies wholly on organic traffic works well for you because you have a background in paid search and you can quickly diversify that traffic stream. Although an over-reliance on organic search is a negative in the grand scheme of things, you can quickly fix that issue, making it acceptable when it's flagged up in your fact-based DD check. And developing a subjective DD system to run potential purchases by is something that's personal to you. And as such, the one-time development of it isn't something that you should outsource or hire out to someone else. What I'm going to show you today is a subjective system based on my own tolerance of what's acceptable. And you can use this as a basis for developing one of your own. It's worth mentioning that this system has proved itself not just for me, but for others who have used it exactly as is in consistently helping them make good buying decisions. And by the way, if you need any of the slides from this presentation, You can download them from centurica.com/QLB. And you'll get some other goodies in there, including links to all the resources I mentioned a little later on, and a sample due diligence report that you can work from for your own potential acquisitions. Okay, so subjective DD looks at 3 areas of any web-based business, which are the primary model, the age, and the niche, or niche, depending on whether you're from the UK or US. For some of those areas, there's also the idea of a traffic light system, and it's an easy way of tagging and categorizing the information you need to process. So a green light is qualities that are highly attractive based on our own sort of internal investment criteria, which is formed mostly from prior knowledge and experience. A red light are qualities that are unattractive, or qualities that carry a certain amount of risk based on our own investment criteria again, but formed from prior knowledge, experience, and also recent external changes and events. Amber are qualities that require further verification, or they're contingent on more factors. The idea is, if an opportunity has a red light in any area, you pass on it straight away without any question or discussion, and having the discipline to do this will save you hours over time. If an opportunity has all green lights, then it's usually wise to proceed by looking at more in-depth information, for example, signing an NDA or requesting a brochure from the broker or seller. If an opportunity has both green and amber lights, you can analyze just the amber areas before deciding whether you are personally comfortable with it, or whether you're personally comfortable with the amber aspects, and whether or not you want to proceed. And I'll drill into each area in a little more detail before showing you a simple way to bring it all together to make a system you can hang a decision on based on a real example. The first thing we look at is the primary model, and in layman's terms, the primary model is just the main reason for a visitor to engage with the site. So our green light models are blog and content sites, e-commerce portals. Amber are forums, marketplaces, private member sites, SaaS, web applications, service providers, social and dating. And red light are directory and aggregators, bookmarking sites, and file sharing. So green light models are highly attractive from an investment perspective because they tend to be incredibly liquid, and generally they're always in demand, which means that they tend to have strong resale values and a growing market of people who are willing to buy them. They also have little to no requirements for specialist knowledge on the whole, or any kind of technical expertise, and they generally have low resource requirements relative to their turnover. The exception to this is e-commerce sites that warehouse a significant proportion of their inventory rather than ones that dropship. Amber models will generally require more verification due to forums, which tend to have high impressions and low click-through rates, few options for monetization, and a constant requirement for moderation. Marketplaces, social, dating, and private member sites are heavily dependent on reaching critical mass, and they're also heavily dependent on things like the quality of user engagement and the rate of new customer acquisition. So these are all things that you need to look into before going ahead and making that decision to buy. SaaS and web applications also require a technical assessment of the product and its code base, in addition to also looking at things like user engagement and retention analysis. And red light models, they should generally be avoided unless you have a healthy appetite for risk. And this is mostly due to the red light models having few repeat visits, which usually results in a lower customer lifetime value. And this limits customer acquisition this limits your customer acquisition to methods like social and organic, and it makes paid acquisition near impossible, which means when it comes to growing and scaling the site, you're probably going to run into difficulties. And also you've got difficult organic user acquisition thanks to Google's frequent changes against sites that aggregate, reuse, or repurpose content. Most of these sites fail to achieve an RPU that allows them to profitably buy traffic, so you're stuck between a rock and a hard place where you can't buy it, you can't get it organically, so you're kind of left in a middle zone where you're floating along and receiving whatever you can. A site might fall into red despite it being a good side business. So for example, you might find a directory site with good in-depth reviews and user-generated content, but the whole idea in this concept is designed to save you time overall. The good opportunities that you come across will more than outweigh the rare sort of less than 5% of opportunities that you miss because it's drifted into a red light category despite it being good. The next thing we'll look at is age. And the good news is this section will be incredibly short. I can probably sum it up in 1 or 2 lines, which is simply stay away from younger sites. Unless you're buying to save you... What's that, Mark?
Before we move on, we have a question on that previous section here.
No problem.
And just a question about game sites. For example, sites that have hundreds of games for free play. Where would you place that in your stoplight model?
Generally, I'd put games in amber. In some ways, it sort of falls under social. In some ways, it falls under web applications. I put it in amber because it generally depends on the site, and you need to look at things like engagement. How long are people playing those games for? Ultimately, are the games any good, or is it purely there just to get cheap impressions and clicks?
Great, thanks.
Does that answer the question okay?
Yep, I think so. And Ian, if you have a follow-up, feel free to type that on in.
Brilliant. So unless you're buying a site to save you time in building an identical site yourself, or the business behind the site doesn't really matter, then I would personally class any site under 12 months as a red light and avoid it at all costs. Ideally, a green light purchase should have at least 3 years of history to be considered stable and reliable, whilst 1 to 3 years will fall into amber. It might be fine to proceed, but only if you have evidence of strong performance during that 1 to 3 year period. When you buy any established site, a fair amount of your cash goes towards buying history, and that's important for 2 reasons. If the site generates revenue, then older sites are usually more of a guarantee that the revenue is stable. For example, a site that has seen 3,000 in monthly AdSense payouts for the last year is far more likely to have a sustainable way of doing this than one that is 4 months old and has only recently hit that peak in its revenue. In fact, a 4-month-old site generating 3K of AdSense revenue is, in my opinion, 90% likely to be a short-lived opportunity or a scam, and one that will eventually die off or be banned completely for doing something that Google doesn't quite trust. There's also the issue with search traffic. Assuming your site relies on at least some search traffic, which over 90% of sites do, then a site under 12 months old is still likely to be in Google's metaphorical sandbox. I keep making the inverted commas fingers, forgetting no one can see me. Which is a sort of testing ground for new sites where technically anything can happen. And new sites tend to receive no search traffic in the first 3 months, followed by an abnormally high amount in months 3 to 9, especially if the owner knows how to game the system. And unfortunately, rookie buyers will often take over a site at month 6, for example, and then a few months later end up with buyer's remorse when their traffic halves and they're left with the realization that the surge in traffic was just temporary. So new sites tend to be trouble, whilst age sites are usually worth more for several reasons, stability, proof of concept, and age backlinks being just a few. And finally in this section, we'll look at the niche, and also the vertical. And the following is far from being an exhaustive list of niches. However, it does cover the majority of niches occupied by websites and internet businesses typically available for sale. So in green light, we've got things like finance, healthcare, employment, education, property, travel. In amber, things like business, marketing, motors, entertainment, health, family parenting, home and leisure, romance, beauty, fashion, MMO and internet marketing, news, sport and social media. And our red light verticals are adult, consumer electronics, copyrighted downloads, viewing, technology, and video games. So the green light niches tend to be those that typically have a large number of competing or corporate advertisers with a substantial budget, which usually results in a high RPU, which is revenue per user across the niche. These also tend to be niches where a wide variety of monetization strategies exist alongside traditional plays such as advertising or product sales, which ultimately means more options. Red light niches are those where attracting advertisers can be difficult due to the nature of the product or the content on offer, or where legal action is frequently a possibility and something that could affect the operation of the business. And this also extends to niches where there are also few monetization options or difficulty in establishing authority in that niche. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead there. Amber niches tend to work well for some buyers, especially those who have prior experience or other sites in that niche, but on the whole, they can be problematic, especially if you're new to that niche or industry. And personal bias comes into this section the most, and when doing this for yourself, you might choose to rearrange some of those niches. I personally know investors who only work with adult sites, for example, because they understand the space and they already have systems in place to support the new business that they acquire. So unless you have a compelling reason or a lot of experience in one of the amber or red light niches, my advice would generally be to stick with what's in the green light category, as it's by far the easiest selection of niches to achieve commercial success in, even in the light of all the competition that already operates there. So let's take a quick look at an example and see how we could quickly use this to eliminate it or to decide whether or not to proceed with more information. So this is a listing which I've actually stolen from from Mark's site, quite like. And if we look at this based on sort of model, age, niches, it's a senior living publishing platform. So in terms of the model, it appears to sell, I really should have read this ahead of time. It appears to sell advertising, and it offers that advertising to people who advertise to seniors looking for senior living accommodation. So the business model in this case is a blog or a content site, in which case it would be in our green light section. The age of the site was launched in 1998, which makes it well over 10 years old. Again, it would be a green light. And in terms of the niche or the vertical, it's in healthcare. So again, it's another green light. 3 green lights, in my opinion, would mean that it's great to proceed and get further information on that. So I could carry on, request the information, sign the NDA, and not have to worry about it not meeting my own personal criteria. On the flip side, we've got this gem, which was from BizBuySell, and this is a file sharing site. By no means am I suggesting that the files on this site are illegal or infringing copyright in any way, but the chances are with any site that does file sharing, there's always going to be a huge moderation burden or a huge issue with people potentially having pirated material, pirated content on there. So in this case, the model is a file sharing model, which is instantly a red light. The age is established in 2009, so in terms of age, it gets a green light. And in terms of the niche or the vertical, it falls into copyrighted downloads or viewing, so again, it's another red light. So even with just one red light, that for me would instantly be a pass. I just wouldn't continue or go any further. And one of the advantages of using this system is that once you've got the initial system set up, which is something you should do yourself, you can delegate or outsource the task of searching for an acquisition, effectively saving you time. So being able to systemize the process of filtering or weeding out purchases that don't make a good fit means you can hire a VA on somewhere like Elance or Guru to monitor several marketplaces or sources and only send through those opportunities that will potentially work, saving you valuable time to focus on doing the right deal. So this is only half of the due diligence puzzle. And once you've found a business that meets your subjective criteria, it's time to put it to the test. And next, I'll give you an overview of how we compile a fact-based DD report. So there's no magic to the service we offer at Centurica when we create due diligence report for clients. And I'm always happy to tell people exactly what we do and how we do it. At the end of this webinar, I'll also give you the link again to the resources pack, which you can download and use the example report as a template to perform your own due diligence. The real value in the service we provide is really just saving clients time and offering the benefit of our experience, but much of what we do is about following a trusted and consistent process, and that's one that I'll share with you now. Many of the DD reports we create for clients are bespoke based on what that specific client needs and the business that they're looking at. For example, one client may need verification of an e-commerce business's cost of goods figures, whilst another may need an independent assessment of the market or niche that a site operates in and any existing competition that may be there. We do, however, have a standard core that all of our full reports are built around, and that core looks at the domain, it looks at on-site factors, it looks at traffic and marketing, it looks at revenue, and it also looks at the seller. So regardless of which report someone opts for, regardless of what business that report is for, these things are always in there. And we'll start by looking at how we analyze the domain. So when we look at a domain, our primary objectives are firstly to establish who the true owner of the domain is, and most likely who the true owner of the business is, and also to detect whether the business could have changed hands recently. And to perform these checks, you'll need a premium subscription to something like Domain Tools or any other good WHOIS utility. And again, I'll link to a selection of tools you can use for every section of this presentation at the end of the webinar. Performing a check on the owner is relatively straightforward. You simply run the query, and Domain Tools or whichever WHOIS utility you're using will give you the information that it has. In this example, I'll be checking that the entity who owns the domain is in fact the same person selling the domain. So you'd need to match that up with the information the broker or the marketplace gives you. You won't find this to be too much of an issue with a brokered site, as any good broker will often do this check for you, but it's an invaluable thing to do if you're buying from someone on a marketplace or direct from a seller that you don't know. And you'll also need to go back a few records to establish any changes in the site's registrant, name, server, or IP details, and piece that information together to work out the likelihood that the site was recently sold. For example, if I can see that the registrant, the name server, and the IP address of a site all changed 6 months ago, for example, then there's a really high chance that the site had changed hands or been sold at that time. And this is really important to know, because a site that was only bought in the last year, for example, may have some hidden issues if the new owner is attempting to sell it already. At this stage in your DD, you'll also want to discover if the site has had any issues with spam or appears on any blacklists, and also the true site age, which is not always a domain age. So you can find historical records which will show the site in its current incantation. And there's a link in the resources pack to 2 free tools that will handle both of these 2 things for you. And our next step from here is to analyze the site itself. So our primary objectives here are to check the site's primary engagement metric, which is pages per visitor, and also to check for anything in direct violation of Google's quality guidelines. You can calculate the average number of pages per visitor by taking the page views per month and dividing that by total visits for the same period. And this is a really useful metric to know, because it instantly alerts you to potential engagement problems if any do exist. So for example, the industry average PPV for an e-commerce site is around 2.2 pages per visit or per session. So given a margin of around 30%, we know that a site with a PPV massively below this indicates that visitors most likely find the content thin or poorly targeted. And likewise, a really high number can either be a sign of good engagement, in other words, a visitor likes a site enough to want to read more. However, an excessively high number can sometimes be a sign of traffic spoofing or the use of scripts designed to increase page views to deceive advertisers. You need to take this information and weigh it up in context against the site that you're analysing to make a common sense decision. Like anything when you're performing DD, you can't just take this figure in isolation and expect a reliable result, and it does need to be compared to other similar sites in that niche. But that said, it can help us paint a picture along with the other data we look at, helping identify something that isn't quite right. You'll also want to check the site against Google's quality guidelines, which is a checklist of 20 or so principles that determine their idea of a quality site. And this may not be so important if the site doesn't rely on Google traffic, but it's generally a good indication of a quality site. And it also gives you a list of areas to fix if you decide to make the purchase. And there's a link to this checklist in the resource pack. So whilst you're here, it's also useful to check if the site uses any cloned or scraped content, or if it's had its content copied by other sites, and whether or not there are any trademark issues associated with the site, the domain, or the business behind it. And once again, there's a link to some free tools to help you do both of those in the webinar resource pack. Most of your DD work will be around traffic and marketing, and this forms the part of our DD reports that typically take the most time to complete. Whilst I don't have long enough to show you everything, I'm going to cover a few points that I think are pretty important to know. And your primary objectives here, or at least for this part in the webinar, are spotting unsustainable, fraudulent, or low-quality traffic sources, verifying the traffic information supplied to ensure it's accurate, and also trying to predict any likely drops in a site's traffic and hence its revenue. And one of the most important things to look for is how dependent the site is on various sources of traffic. So, for example, many people assume that organic traffic is golden because it's free and it converts well, and this is true, but When a site receives more than half of its visits from Google or Bing search, for example, there's a really high possibility that many of those visits could easily be taken away with a penalty or an algorithm update, or simply from new competitors entering that market and pushing the site further down in search results. Any site that receives more than 60% of its traffic from search is, in my opinion, a big gamble, because you have no control over that traffic and it could half or even disappear overnight. Another common issue is where a site receives the majority of its visits from direct or referral traffic, and there can sometimes be a good logical explanation for this. Maybe the business does a lot of offline advertising, or it's the kind of site with a short URL that people tend to type in directly. The problem is where we can't really explain where that traffic comes from, and as such, you have no control over it. It could drop or it could disappear at any point, and you'll be powerless to do anything about it. In the case of referral traffic, it's also a double-edged sword. If a blog receives 50% of its visits from hundreds of links on different respected established blogs and portals, then that's a good thing. The problem is when all of those referrals come from just a few sites or blogs, or as is most common, 80% comes from just one site. The danger is that this link could be removed at any time, or worse still, the site may be owned by the same seller, who will remove or redirect the link after he's made the sale. And you often see referral traffic problems with products sold on internet marketing forums like the Warrior Forum, where a seller might do tens of thousands in revenue during the early month, but completely flatline after that tiny forum market becomes saturated and the product just fails to sell anywhere else. If you've purchased the business just after it's had its best month, then you're in for inevitable disappointment. Likewise, if an owner is frequently launching and as such receives most of their new customers from using other sites' email lists, then you have that inherent risk that you don't own or control any of those lists. So recreating the traffic as you, the person without all of those relationships and strategic partnerships, is going to be difficult. And the main point to take away is that there are hidden dangers with nearly any traffic source. So your job here really is to check how dependent the site is on each one and have a good contingency in place should it ever run dry. You'll also want to check that the traffic to the site is genuine, and it's not uncommon for some unscrupulous sellers to spoof their traffic to either give the impression that the site is doing better than it actually is, or to disguise fake purchases or clicks that they're making themselves. And anybody can buy really cheap traffic. 5,000 targeted visitors cost less than $25, and it usually comes from bots or pop-onders, neither of which will ever convert to revenue. Many people will be also surprised to learn that you can fool programs like Google Analytics into thinking that that bot traffic actually came from Google itself as organic search traffic. So when you analyze a site's traffic, here's what we recommend you do to avoid being caught out. So firstly, avoid server stats as your source of analytics at all costs. Even Google Analytics can be fooled, but it's much harder. Spoofing server stats simply requires changing a few files on the server, and it's much more likely that the data you're seeing will be incorrect, even without deliberate deception on the part of the seller. If a seller claims to have significant organic traffic, do a reality check. Use tools like MozRank to see where they rank for the keywords that seem to deliver the majority of their traffic in the analytics report. And you can take MozRank's traffic estimates to work out if the total traffic claimed by the site is realistic or not. And the 80-20 rule applies here, where 80% of the site's organic traffic will usually come from the top 3 to 10 keywords, so you don't need to check a few to get an idea. If you don't know what keywords the site ranks for, or it no longer shows in Google Analytics, you can use keyword data from Bing, or even better, the site's Webmaster Tools account if they have one, and they can add you as a guest. This part of your due diligence is so in-depth, I'd urge you to take a look at the sample report I'll share with you in the resource pack at the end of this presentation to get an idea of some of the other checks that we perform, because this really is a big in-depth part of what you'll do. So with revenue, our primary objectives are ultimately to spot unsustainable, fraudulent or low quality revenue sources. We want to verify the revenue data supplied to ensure that it's accurate. And we also want to look for issues that will come with transferring revenue accounts. And just like with traffic sources, every source of revenue has its own qualities that determine how sustainable it is. For example, a site that relies on software sales, for example, from one particular forum, is unlikely to be sustainable. At some point, the market for that product will become saturated and sales will tail off. Advertising sold on a CPC basis, however, is much more sustainable, and it will continue to generate an income so long as the site has traffic. The idea is to look at all the contributing sources of revenue and ultimately establish, one, the reliability, two, how seasonal it is. So, for example, textbook sales will peak at various times of the year, so if you take a 3-month average, it could be misleading. And finally, you want to look at how easy it would be to replace that revenue source. You'll also need to consider how transferable a particular revenue account is, and I'll give you a few examples. Some revenue accounts are really easy to transfer, and they simply involve adding yourself as a new user and removing the seller. So, for example, an Amazon Associates account. Likewise, some accounts are not directly transferable, but they're still easy to transfer. So the best example is Google AdSense. Whilst you can't transfer the AdSense account unless it's registered to a company that you're acquiring, you can easily set up your own account and simply switch the AdSense ID over in the site's HTML, so clicks and hence payments will be then credited to you. But it's not always this straightforward. A site that has several affiliate accounts will often be problematic to transfer, especially if the new owner is from a different country to the seller. Many affiliate programs have fairly strict criteria, and so it's not always guaranteed that you will be able to set up all the accounts that the previous seller had. So naturally, it's best to check this during your due diligence and get a head start on any problem issues early. Another issue is where the site has recurring revenue clients set up to be billed through something like PayPal. And unless you're taking over the business attached to the account, you can't transfer the entire PayPal account, and hence you can't transfer individual subscriptions. So this leaves you in a situation where you're forced to ask clients to resubscribe, something that will inevitably lose a percentage of the site's existing business. Your main concern with revenue is to verify its accuracy, and this is more difficult than verifying supply traffic data. And although I say revenue, we often use this as a broad term to often include verifying costs too, and hence profit, depending on how the business being sold operates. So when we verify revenue accounts for Centurica clients, we tend to favor a live screen share, and here are a few quick tips to help you do your own. So number one is always start by checking the setup on the seller's machine. You'll be viewing a live screen share, and I share a few free tools to do this in the resource pack. And it's good practice to start by checking that the seller doesn't have his or her machine configured to route to a spoof version of one of the sites that you're checking. For example, I could set up a fake PayPal site on my local machine and configure my computer so that when I go to paypal.com, I'm taken to my own local version that will show whatever I want it to. To check that isn't the case, you should examine their host file before starting. And if anyone's confused by that, by all means ask and I'll be happy to explain it. Two is to watch them log into each revenue account progressively. I usually start with the ones that have the most data, such as merchant accounts, as they usually queue reporting. So this way you can run the reports you need to, and then check on another revenue account at a different tab, and come back to that one when the report has been created and it's available to download. Three is to choose a snapshot of periods that will give you good coverage of the information that you're verifying. Now, in an ideal world, you'll check everything, but if your or the seller's time is finite, which it probably is, then it's usually a good idea just to check the last 4 months, the last full year, and another 2 months that you've selected at random, and then just check that the totals agree with the data that you've been supplied. And finally, and possibly the biggest one, is be careful with PayPal. There's no solid way of telling exactly what site a sale originated from, but you can examine random transactions to get an idea for who the buyers were and where they were located. So if your site primarily does business in the US, but you notice there's a lot of transactions from Denmark or Indonesia, then that should probably set some alarm bells ringing. The final part of your core due diligence should be concerned with looking at the seller, and our primary objectives here are really to find out if the seller owns any sites that they've not disclosed that could potentially compete with the business they're selling, and also to discover any previous and related sites sold by the same seller. And this involves the most detective work of the whole process, and it's more about being able to systematically create a picture from trails and little pieces of information such as server information, domain information, code footprints, and other relevant bits of info. So undisclosed sites in a similar niche pose a threat for three main reasons. One is that once the seller has sold the business for sale, there's every chance they could launch a competing business using the same strategy that has brought them success with their current one. The site could also be referring a substantial amount of traffic to the site that you're purchasing, and this will cause a problem if the seller decides to sell that site or redirect the traffic elsewhere after you've taken ownership of the business for sale. And also the site might contain backlinks to the site that you're purchasing, so if the seller decides to remove those links post-purchase, this could inevitably affect your search rankings. Often a seller could genuinely forget to include a site that maybe they started some time ago, but haven't since had a chance to maintain. In this case, merely prompting them to include it in the sale is all you might need. But on the other hand, I have seen situations where sellers deliberately haven't disclosed URLs or sites they own because they intend to keep operating that as a separate and competing business. What you do at this stage is entirely up to you, but personally I'd give the seller the ultimatum of including it in the sale, or I'd walk away from the deal. The deception would also put me on high alert about everything else that has been supplied. So I appreciate we're running out of time. I'll bring this to a close. I mean, this has been a real quick overview of the due diligence process, and by no means is it everything you need to do, but I hope it will give you a good few solid areas to start massively reducing the chances of your next purchase failing to work out. The main takeaway is that every purchase is different, and the due diligence that you do should be guided partly by process and experience, but a small part should be common sense, and it should be specific to the asset that you're looking at. If you have any questions, or if there's anything you feel I haven't covered, I'll be happy to take as many questions as we've got time for right now. Or alternatively, if you need someone experienced to run this entire process for you, Centurica are always happy to help. Or you can reach me anytime during GMT daylight hours on clarity.fm. Thanks for attending, and I'll hand it back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Justin. Fantastic. You're right. There's a lot to cover with this topic of due diligence, and so this is a good overview. We do have a couple questions that I promised I would ask, but before I ask those, I wanted to make 2 points on the verifying traffic portion of what you said. The one thing that I would note to buyers is to be wary of some of the third-party sites that try to estimate traffic. I'm actually a big fan of using them for competitive intelligence and also to help quantify what a website is doing. But always keep in mind that third-party websites such as SEMrush, such as SpyFu, such as some of these other sites that try and estimate traffic are doing just that. They're estimating without direct access to the website. We've seen a number of times where all these third-party sites are estimating a drop in traffic when no drop in traffic actually occurred. We're able to verify that out in multiple ways. So use them as a tool, and I think one of the tricks